the whole point of US sanctions, the stated goals of US sanctions, are to basically hold other countries accountable for their human rights abuses. And so the whole idea is supposed to be that, oh, this country is attacking the free press, or this country is having a brutal police crackdown on people. And so the US government and, the UN governments around the world, Western governments typically, they implement these sanctions on countries because in their eyes, if we can hurt them economically, it's not military intervention. We're not going to war with them, so it must be better, right? As we're going to see today, that is not the case at all. And so now I'm going to share my screen with you all, and we'll kind of dive into that topic. So this is the U.S. Department of Treasury, sanctions programs and country information. So these are all the places that the U.S. has sanctions now. And last I've heard, it's about 39 different countries that are impacted by U.S. sanctions. This list here, I think, has about 37 when I counted. Let's look at a few of them. We've got Belarus sanctions. We've got Burma-related sanctions. We've got Cuba sanctions, counterterrorism sanctions, Ethiopia-related sanctions, Hong Kong, Iran, Iraq, Libya, Lebanon, North Korea, Nicaragua, Somalia, Sudan, Syria, and Venezuela. And so you can see we sanction a lot of countries, and both parties participate in this, and we'll get to that a little bit later. But so I wanted to kind of highlight a few of these sanctions that we are engaged in. And so let's start here with humanitarian impact of sanctions on Venezuela. So I'll read a little bit. On 12th of February 2021, Elena Duhan, the UN Special Rapporteur on Unilateral Coercive Measures in Human Rights, released a preliminary report condemning international sanctions against Venezuela. So that's the UN condemning unilateral sanctions against Venezuela. Over 5 years since these sanctions were first introduced, the country faces a desperate humanitarian crisis, whilst the Maduro regime remains in place, calling into question the morality and efficacy of such measures. And it'll explain just how bad US sanctions on Venezuela have been for the people of Venezuela. Many major world powers have implemented coercive measures against Venezuela in response to public corruption, human rights abuses, and anti-democratic actions taken by the Maduro government. The US has led the most severe sanctions, which began when President Obama, so this is kind of highlighting a little bit how these are bipartisan, both Democrats and Republicans, declared a national emergency and implemented targeted sanctions in 2015. Not so targeted, as we'll see. The 2018 Venezuelan presidential election was shrouded in controversy and placed the country in political turmoil amid a battle for presidency between incumbent Nicolas Maduro and the leader of the National Assembly, Juan Guaido. The Trump administration was one of the first to officially recognize Guaido as interim president in January 2019 and proceeded to embark on a campaign of maximum pressure designed to loosen Maduro's illegitimate grip on power. Now, Maduro did win elections. It's disputed whether those elections were free and fair or not, but he did win the elections. Basically, the whole argument being put out by the US and the West in general is that because they cracked down on opposition leading up to the election was entirely illegitimate. And in the Venezuelan constitution, it says that if, there's something, basically says that if elections are not fair, or if no leader is decided or whatever, that the Speaker of the House becomes, or their equivalent of the Speaker of the House becomes the president, which would have been Juan Guaido, who didn't stand in these elections, didn't win any votes, is not broadly popular. That's why it's been so controversial. Maduro does have popularity in the country, regardless of, whether we think the election was fully fair or not. So in August 2019, Trump scaled up sanctions and authorized a full economic embargo against Venezuela. Sanctions introduced by the EU in 2017 and upheld by the UK post-Brexit have prohibited the admission of listed individuals in member countries, banned the export of certain goods such as arms and telecommunications equipment, and frozen Venezuelan assets in the territory of the EU and the UK. That's been billions, hundreds of billions of dollars frozen. And so here we get to more of the specifics. Venezuela was once the largest economic power in Latin America, but now finds itself in a dire situation amid consistent economic decline since 2014, around the time of these sanctions. This has been exacerbated by sanctions on core industries of oil, gold, and manufacturing, and the freezing of central bank assets. Dohan reports a 99% decline in government revenue compared to pre-sanction levels, which has led to a near collapse or a near complete breakdown of public services due to insufficient funding. In an interview with the Gray Zone, Dohan states, before the blockade, Venezuela was spending 76% of its oil revenues on social programs. Now it can't even invest 1% of that. Dohan argues that sanctions on the economic activity directly impede the government's ability to guarantee the human rights of its population, which has had a devastating effect on the whole population of Venezuela. And so one of the big reasons why this is so important, the 76% of oil revenues and social programs, that was very controversial for US politicians. They did not like the fact that Venezuela nationalized their oil and kept the profits for their own selves, for their social programs. John Bolton himself, who was in the Trump administration, John Bolton had said that they wanted US oil companies to be allowed in. Juan Guaido, person they wanted in power, had said he was going to let them come in. And so this just shows it's from 76% on social programs to less than 1%. And so you hear a lot about starvation in Venezuela. You hear a lot about medical shortages, and that's why a lot of people flee Venezuela. But they often blame the Maduro regime without mentioning how US sanctions have significantly contributed to the problem. Let's move on to another example, Iran. So here is from Human Rights Watch. Iran, sanctions threatening health. US should ensure effective humanitarian exemptions. It's very hard to get those exemptions. Usually sanctions in general just hurt the populations. The Trump administration's broad sanctions on Iran have drastically constrained the ability of the country to finance humanitarian imports, including medicines, causing serious hardships for ordinary Iranians and threatening their right to health. Human Rights Watch said in a report released today, the administration in Washington should take immediate steps to ensure a viable channel exists for the trade of humanitarian goods with Iran. The 47-page report, Maximum Pressure, which we've said before, that's kind of the US's angle with sanctions. US economic sanctions harm Iranians' right to health, documents how broad restrictions on financial transactions, coupled with aggressive rhetoric from US officials, have drastically constrained the ability of Iranian entities to finance humanitarian imports, including vital medicines and medical equipment. So that's another example of US sanctions aimed for human rights purposes having human rights consequences. It's just showing us that sanctions are not peaceful. Sanctions are violent for the people that we impose them on. Here we go for another example, Cuba. Harm and inefficacy, the US sanctions on Cuba. Over a span of 43 years and across 8 American presidencies, the CIA came up with or executed plans to assassinate former Cuban leader Fidel Castro about 638 times. So in the example of Cuba, sanctions have not been just the only tool we've attempted to use. There have been explicit regime change attempts for decades. These plans ranged from spiking Castro's cigars with a botulinum toxin, I can say it, that would explode when used, to contaminating Castro's diving suits with deadly fungi, to character assassination attempts that involved spraying his broadcasting studio with LSD-like drugs. Although these plans failed one after the other, the US government remained undeterred and would continue assassination attempts until the end of the Clinton administration. So again, bipartisan, both parties, Democrats and Republicans. Ever since the founding of Cuba and their almost immediate alignment with the Eastern Bloc and against American imperialism, our main topic of the day, the US has taken an aggressively hostile approach toward the nation, trying to stage a coup through the Bay of Pigs invasion, sending spies to infiltrate the Cuban government, and hatching schemes to assassinate Castro. Though all of these plots have either completely failed or seen very limited success, the US has, in fact, implemented one thing that saw tremendous success, not in terms of its purported aims, but rather in hurting the Cuban people. Sanctions. US sanctions against Cuba not only hurt both Cuban and American citizens, but also serve none of their intended political ends for the United States. Although they are aimed at pressuring Cuba to liberalize and democratize, such results have failed to materialize. Instead, sanctions have become a source of both economic and humanitarian damages for both Cubans and Americans. The sanctions were first implemented in October of 1960 and banned the trade of all goods except food and humanitarian supplies. After overthrowing the previously US-backed Batista dictatorship, US-backed dictatorship, Castro sought to establish friendly relations between Cuba and the US and made overtures to the neighboring nation, all of which were rebuffed by a distrustful Eisenhower administration. Well, that's because Castro overthrew their dictatorship, huh? In the following months, the US government viewed Cuba with increasing suspicion and hostility as Cuba established growing ties with the Soviet Union, communists. This tension culminated in Eisenhower's decision to ban all US oil exports to Cuba. Cuba had no choice but to turn to the Soviet Union for oil, but when oil arrived in Cuba, Eisenhower forbade the US-owned companies in Cuba from refining it. Castro was essentially forced to nationalize the US oil firms. And it is this action that directly prompted the embargo against Cuba. Similar to Venezuela, American capitalists do not like when socialist countries, communist countries, when they attempt to nationalize the oil. Because when you nationalize the oil, it's no longer in the hands of private industry. Now it's owned by the state and used for social welfare for that state. They do good things with that money, but the US wants that money. The embargo has not been lifted since. Barack Obama, to his credit, tried to lift it, but was blocked by Congress. A bipartisan fashion, I'll add. The economic cost of these sanctions is steep, and this is where we get into the important part. According to the United Nations, the embargo has cost Cuba roughly $130 billion in economic value over 6 decades. Although this number may seem negligible, it is in fact about 1.5 times Cuba's annual GDP of $87 billion. So we're depriving the Cubans of hundreds of billions of dollars. At the same time, the US International Trade Commission estimates that if the US lifts the embargo, the US export of select agricultural sectors and all manufactured products to Cuba would increase by about $1.8 billion annually. It's a lot of money that the Cuban government would be getting if we weren't sanctioning them. During Cuba's economic crisis last year, Cuban President Miguel Diaz-Canel blamed Trump's tightening sanctions, which he claimed severely limited their economic growth. I mean, we got evidence of that right there. More importantly, the embargo has a sizable human toll. Studies have shown that the embargo contributes to, or quote, contributes to increasing health threats and the decline of some health indicators, unquote, along with making the, quote, supply of essential goods more costly, more difficult, and more time-consuming to procure and maintain. Additionally, medical restrictions as a result of the embargo have been linked with historic increases in tuberculosis deaths, diarrheal cases, and contaminated water. A nationwide pandemic of optic and peripheral neuropathy was linked with food shortages caused by the embargo, and more recently, the Cuban government has argued that the embargo is a massive obstacle in receiving coronavirus-related supplies. And again, all of this just shows we haven't overthrown the government of Cuba. We haven't changed the government of Cuba. They're trying to be socialist. They're trying to use their money for their own people, for their own good, and the US doesn't like it. So another big example, North Korea, the humanitarian impact of sanctions on North Korea. Since North Korea conducted its first nuclear test in 2006, something they do to prevent, I'll just add this as my own aside, that's something they do to protect themselves from the US. During the Korean War, the US killed 1/4 of the population of North Korea. In order to defend their goal of a socialist government, North Korea feels that nuclear weapons are necessary as a deterrent, because if they have nuclear weapons, the US can't invade them again. And we're still threatening that in South Korea. We're still constantly threatening that on North Korea. The UN Security Council has imposed nearly a dozen sanctions against the country, adding to unilateral US sanctions. While advocates of sanctions may regard them as a peaceful alternative to military action, as I've stated before, there is evidence that sanctions take a significant humanitarian toll on the North Korean people, restricting the work of NGOs, humanitarian agencies, and aid groups that provide a lifeline for some 13 million vulnerable North Koreans. In direct contravention of the 1949 Geneva Conventions, sanctions punish North Korean civilians for the actions of their government. Here's how sanctions harm ordinary North Koreans. Sanctions hinder urgently needed humanitarian aid and could result in devastating long-term effects. Are we sensing a pattern here yet? That US sanctions, global sanctions against countries we consider authoritarian, hurt their people? According to a 2018 UNICEF report, 200,000 North Korean children already suffer from acute malnutrition, and sanctions put 60,000 of these vulnerable children at risk of starvation due to the disruption in the availability of humanitarian supplies caused by tightening sanctions. Unilateral US sanctions delay or outright block vital humanitarian shipments to the North Korean people. One NGO recently reported that it took them over a year and a half to ship 16 boxes of beans to the DPRK, Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Sanctions passed in 2017 prohibit the transport of any metal goods, significantly hampering the shipment of basic medical supplies. A shipment of reproductive health kits was subjected to significant delay because it contained aluminum steam sterilizers, the most important part of the kit. Sanctions target North Korea's civilian economy and harm the most vulnerable members of its population. More examples. Current sanctions have the greatest impact not on the power elites, who are the intended targets, but on the most vulnerable North Koreans, working class families, particularly children, and seniors living in remote areas with restricted access to medical supplies, food, and fuel for cooking and heating. Additionally, bans on exports and the dispatch of workers abroad impact the ability of ordinary citizens to support their livelihood. The ban on textile exports, in particular, is exerting a disproportionate effect on female employment, which represents the majority of the labor force in that sector. I mean, it's just crazy how we do these things because we claim we want to protect the people of these countries. We want to save them from a dictatorial government. And what ends up happening? We just kill people. We deprive them of food. We deprive them of medicines. We deprive them of the right to choose their own destiny. We're forcing our will on them. It's not what their people are asking for. And so there is a bill. Here, let me talk about it here. The Renacer Act. And it's basically more sanctions, but this time on the country of Nicaragua. And so I'm going to play a video from Barbara Larcom, coordinator of CASA Baltimore LeMay. Just for a little context on that, they're a friendship city project connecting the people of San Juan de LeMay, Nicaragua, and the Baltimore, Maryland region. I'm near there, about 30 minutes away where I grew up. And so I'm going to play this video from Barbara, and we're going to hear just how pervasive these sanctions are.
The Renacer Act, which already passed the U.S. Senate, and it passed one committee in the U.S. House of Representatives, but it has not passed the second committee, and so we still have a chance to beat this thing, okay? And that's what we're trying to do here. H.R. 2946 is an act or a bill which supposedly is promoting democracy in Nicaragua. That is a total lie. I call BS on that one. So what the Renacer Act is really doing is, if it passes, it will impose even more restrictions on any international aid from any international financial institution on the country. And the RICA Act already great damage. And second, it is targeting sanctions. In other words, it at least allows the president to put sanctions on any individuals in the country who are, and I'm going to read some of these, if they work for the government, if they are a member of the FSLN. Now, there are 2 million or more registered members of the FSLN in a country of 6.3 million people, and that includes the kids, okay? They could also target the families of any party members, regardless of whether they're in the FSLN or not. It also applies to anybody who's in the National Police, the Armed Forces, or the Supreme Electoral Council. So in other words, over half the country could be liable for these sanctions. And so what that does is it is targeting only one side of the political spectrum in Nicaragua, and it happens to be the side that is the most popular in the country, because the FSLN is broadly supported because of the good that they have been doing since 2007 when they came back into power.
I mean, this is what we talk about when you hear the word targeted sanctions, because, we have military action, right? And that's portrayed as the worst thing possible. Then we have sanctions, which are portrayed as a more peaceful option. And then they have that weasel word of targeted sanctions. We're not sanctioning the people of that country. We're targeting them so that it only impacts the bad guys. So it only impacts the people that we want to take out of power because they're hurting people. As demonstrated right here, that's more than half of the country of Nicaragua that could be impacted by these sanctions. And she says a little bit more.
Basically then, the United States, or at least this proposed bill, is claiming to promote democracy in the country, but instead what they're really doing is they're doing the exact opposite. They're preventing people, or they're trying to prevent people from voting their will for who they want as a leader in the country. So we're asking, this is very important, I think, that we need to stop, we need to ask the U.S. to stop interfering in all these different countries, Nicaragua being one, but there are others. As Jill was talking about the sanctions, we've got, 39 countries that are sanctioned right now. We don't want this to pass in Nicaragua. The capitalist system that we're operating under, that is really what's behind this, because that system wants to be able to come in, open up the markets in Nicaragua, and plunder the country, to use people, pay them low wages, and plunder all of their resources, as they have done in so many other places around the world. Please call and ask Congress to oppose the Renacer Act. Thank you.
And that's exactly what U.S. sanctions are intended for, as I demonstrated with the Venezuela example. They put sanctions on a country that is socialist, like Venezuela, like the DPRK, like Nicaragua, because they don't want socialism. The capitalists want to be able to exploit the labor of workers to enrich themselves. They don't want that money going to the social services of that country. We see it in the US with how they always pay us poverty level wages, deprive us of healthcare, deprive us of education. And the US not only does that on their own people, US capitalists attempt to do it on people around the world. And so now I'm going to show you the Renacer Act itself. So who are the main co-sponsors of this act? So I said there is a bill in the US Senate that seeks to sanction nearly half of the population of Nicaragua for democracy. Sanctions threaten lives. Most co-sponsors are Democrats. We have Senator Menendez of New Jersey, Marco Rubio in Florida. He's the only Republican on this co-sponsor list. Senator Durbin in Illinois. Senator Ben Cardin, my senator in Maryland. And Senator Murphy in Connecticut, which, if you'll remember, I don't have the tweet here on demand, but Senator Murphy admit that they were trying to do a regime change operation in Venezuela. And so back to that other thread, this one activist here, Netfa Freeman, he's a Pan-Africanist. He had a really, really, really good explanation of the hypocrisy of U.S. sanctions.
We just heard about the Venezuela Act. We heard about the Nicaragua Act. We also know about the terrorism that they orchestrate in the country, particularly in 2018. We know about the Contra War, the war that they put together, assembled mercenaries to try to fight the Sandinista government. Basically, these are just acts of terrorism. And the United States has the nerve to have a list of state sponsors of terror. If we look at the Venezuela Act and Nicaragua Act, when we think about it, and it's not just Nicaragua, it's all of these countries, that the United States has the audacity to actually codify into law their regime change projects while they talk about other countries influencing their elections and whatnot through, Facebook ads or something else like that. And so we know this pure hypocrisy. It treats indigenous people and formerly enslaved Africans here with the most brutal repression, economic marginalization, and degradation. And so it cannot talk about human rights or democracy in other countries. It's devoid of human rights and democracy. And it's insulting to us for them to claim that they're trying to support human rights and democracy in some other country.
I mean, he's exactly right. I already demonstrated on like 5 different countries how U.S. sanctions hurt human rights. They don't help them. And often they contradict with democracy of those countries. These sanctions here in Nicaragua are going to impact like half the population because that's the popular party in that country. The Sandinistas are popular. People like socialism in those countries. And we're going to show you more later in this video. We're about to finish the sanctions topic. But once we move on to Julian Assange and Daniel Hale and the hypocrisy of U.S. imperialism when it comes to drone warfare, when it comes to attacking the free press, it should be abundantly clear that this is not about human rights and democracy. This is about capitalism versus socialism. And so now that's the perfect segue into the big story that broke yesterday that's actually been out for quite some time now. But we'll talk about that. So let me stop sharing this screen and I'm going to switch it to a new screen